The morning air over the Atlantic coast was sharp with salt and uncertainty. A pale sun climbed slowly over the horizon, its light touching the restless water as if asking permission to rise. On the deck of a wooden ship battered by months of crossing, a man stood barefoot, gripping the rails so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His name was not written in any book yet. History did not know him, but the land ahead would. Behind him were ghosts, famine, debt, religious fear, and a Europe that had decided he was expendable. Ahead of him was a continent that did not promise mercy, only possibility. The year was 1620, and nothing about the future was guaranteed except hardship. This is not the story America likes to tell itself. This is the story of how America actually began, through hunger, blood, broken treaties, impossible hope, and ordinary people who never meant to become legends. As the ship's anchor dropped into unfamiliar waters, the man closed his eyes. He did not know that the decisions made by frightened settlers and watching natives would echo for centuries. He did not know that ideals spoken in whispers would later be shouted in revolutions. He only knew one thing: going back was no longer an option. The shore looked peaceful. That was the lie. Long before Europeans carved lines on maps and named rivers after kings, this land already had a memory. Forests whispered with the footsteps of tribes who had lived here longer than any written history could remember. The Wampanoag, the Powhatan, the Lenape. Nations with laws, diplomacy, warfare, and spirituality watched the strange floating villages arrive with a mix of curiosity and dread. They had seen this before. Disease had come before guns. Invisible death had traveled faster than any ship. Entire villages had vanished years before the settlers arrived, leaving behind empty fields and unanswered prayers. The newcomers mistook this silence for opportunity. It was, in fact, a wound. The settlers stepped on land believing they were chosen. The natives watched them believing they were doomed. Both were right. The first winters were brutal beyond imagination. Food rotted, tools broke, and the cold crept into bones like a living thing. Men who once dreamed of land ownership and freedom now fought over scraps. Graves multiplied faster than houses. Faith was tested not in churches, but in frozen soil, where bodies were buried without ceremony. And yet, people stayed. Why? Because something more powerful than fear had taken hold. A dangerous idea. The belief that a person could start over, that birth did not determine destiny, that authority could be questioned. These ideas were fragile, half-formed, and often contradicted by the settlers' own actions, but once planted, they refused to die. As colonies expanded, so did conflict. Land was not empty. Treaties were signed and broken with equal speed. Native leaders who sought peace found betrayal. Those who fought found annihilation. The forests that once echoed with ancestral songs now rang with gunfire and the crack of falling trees. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had grown into something new and something restless. They were still British, but not really. An ocean separated them from the crown, and distance changed loyalty. Taxes were imposed by men who had never seen these shores, never buried children in colonial winters, never fought frontier wars. Anger brewed in taverns and printing presses. Words became weapons. Pamphlets spread faster than soldiers. No taxation without representation was not just a slogan, it was a warning. When the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, no one could stop what followed. Farmers became soldiers, neighbors became enemies. The war was not clean or heroic. It was cold, hungry, desperate. Men froze at Valley Forge while politicians argued ideals in warm rooms. George Washington was not a myth yet. He was a man who lost battles, doubted himself, and held an army together with sheer will. The revolution succeeded not because it was destined to, but because failure would have meant everything was lost. Independence was declared, but freedom was unfinished. Slavery remained, a contradiction at the heart of the new nation. The words "all men are created equal" echoed hollow in fields where enslaved people worked under the lash. Native nations were pushed west, treaty by treaty, lie by lie. Expansion was called destiny. Those crushed beneath it called it something else. America grew, not gracefully, but violently. Railroads split the continent like scars. The Civil War tore the nation apart, brother against brother, over a sin that could no longer be ignored. More Americans died in that war than any other before or since. The ground drank blood until the idea of union was redefined. After the war came industry, immigration, and cities that swallowed millions. Ellis Island processed hope and fear in equal measure. Some found opportunity, others found sweatshops and slums. The American dream was real, but unevenly distributed. The 20th century brought America onto the world stage through fire. 2 world wars, a Great Depression that humbled a nation, civil rights movements that forced America to confront itself. Progress was made not because it was offered, but because it was demanded. Through it all, the same question returned again and again. Who is America for? The answer has never been simple. It has been argued in courts, fought in streets, written in laws, and sung in protest. America is not a finished story. It is a struggle between its ideals and its actions. And that struggle began the moment barefoot settlers stepped on a quiet shore, believing they were alone. They never were.
The shore did not remain quiet for long. What the settlers called wilderness was, in truth, a living archive. Paths worn by generations, rivers named long before English tongues tried to reshape them, land measured not by ownership, but by responsibility. To the native nations, land was not something to be possessed, it was something to be protected. This single misunderstanding would become one of the most destructive forces in American history. In the early years, survival forced cooperation. Squanto, a man who had already been taken across the ocean as a captive and returned to find his village erased by disease, taught the newcomers how to plant corn in unfamiliar soil. He showed them which fish could be used to fertilize the land, when to plant, when to harvest. Without him, many would have died. The settlers remembered the help, but memory fades when power grows. As ships arrived more frequently, the fragile balance collapsed. Each new group carried more than supplies, they carried entitlement. Charters signed thousands of miles away claimed land never seen, never walked, never understood. The paper said it belonged to the crown. The ground said otherwise. Conflicts followed predictable patterns. First came trade, then came misunderstanding, then came fear, finally violence. The Pequot War burned villages and shattered the illusion that coexistence could be permanent. Entire communities were wiped out in a single night, while colonists called it victory and natives called it massacre. History would later soften the language. The dead would not. By the time the 18th century arrived, the colonies were no longer fragile experiments. They were engines, hungry for land, labor, and control. Tobacco and cotton reshaped entire regions, and at the center of it all stood slavery, woven so tightly into the economy that removing it felt impossible to those who benefited from it. Enslaved Africans arrived in chains, stripped of names, families, and futures. They were told they were property. They were told God had ordained their suffering. And yet they resisted in ways both quiet and explosive, through work slowdowns, secret education, escape, rebellion, and the preservation of culture under impossible conditions. America's wealth grew, its conscience fractured. Meanwhile, colonial identity began to shift. Children born on American soil did not think of England as home. They spoke differently, worshipped differently, governed differently. Distance bred independence, and independence bred defiance. British victories in the French and Indian War removed France as a rival, but left Britain deeply in debt. Parliament looked westward and saw colonies that should pay their share. The colonies looked back and saw tyranny. Taxes followed, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each law tightened the rope. Protests grew louder, redcoats grew more visible. In Boston, tension finally snapped. Snow fell thick the night shots rang out in the street. 5 colonists lay dead. History would remember it as the Boston Massacre. Propaganda would turn it into a rallying cry. The truth lay somewhere in between, but the damage was done. By the time tea was thrown into the harbor, compromise was no longer possible. What had begun as resistance transformed into revolution. The Declaration of Independence was radical not because it declared separation, but because it dared to claim power came from the people, that kings were not divinely ordained, that authority could be overthrown. These ideas were dangerous. The war that followed was not inevitable. It was chaotic, uncertain, and often nearly lost. Washington's army suffered defeats that should have ended everything. Supplies ran out, morale collapsed, desertion spread. Yet the revolution survived through foreign aid, strategic patience, and an enemy that underestimated the resolve of people fighting on their own land. Victory came slowly, painfully. When it finally arrived, it brought relief, but also confusion. 13 colonies had defeated an empire. Now they had to govern themselves. The Constitution was not a perfect document. It was a compromise written by flawed men trying to prevent tyranny without inviting chaos. It protected liberty, but not for all. It balanced power, but entrenched inequality. It postponed questions it could not answer. Still, it endured. As the nation expanded westward, the same pattern repeated itself with ruthless efficiency. Treaties were signed, ignored, and broken. Native nations were pushed from ancestral lands through coercion and force. The Trail of Tears carved suffering into the national memory as thousands died during forced relocation. Expansion was celebrated as progress. Those crushed beneath it were told it was destiny. Industrialization transformed the country again. Machines replaced muscle. Cities swelled with immigrants fleeing famine, war, and poverty. They arrived believing America was a promise. They discovered it was a test. Child labor filled factories. Workers died in unsafe conditions. Wealth concentrated at the top, while millions struggled to survive. Reform did not come easily. It was fought for by unions, activists, journalists who exposed corruption at great personal risk. Then came the crash. The Great Depression erased fortunes overnight. Banks failed, farms turned to dust, breadlines replaced dreams. The American experiment stood on the brink of collapse, not from invasion, but from inequality. Recovery demanded transformation. Government expanded its role. Social safety nets emerged. Trust was slowly rebuilt, just in time for the world to catch fire. World War II pulled America into a global conflict that redefined power. Millions served, millions died. Victory came at unimaginable cost. The atomic age began not with hope, but with devastation. Afterward, America stood unmatched in influence, but divided within. Segregation persisted. Civil rights were denied by law and violence. Progress came again through protest, sacrifice, and courage. The story of America was never about perfection. It was about struggle. Every generation inherited unfinished work. Some moved the nation closer to its ideals, others pulled it back. But the question never disappeared. Who belongs? Who decides? And how much is freedom worth? The answers were still being written.
By the middle of the 19th century, the United States no longer resembled the fragile chain of colonies that had once clung to the Atlantic coast. It had become a continental force, wide, ambitious, and internally divided. The land stretched farther than its moral certainty. The question that haunted the nation was no longer whether America would survive, but what kind of nation it would become. At the center of everything stood slavery. For decades it had been tolerated, rationalized, postponed. Politicians spoke of balance. Compromise after compromise was hammered together, each one thinner than the last. Free states and slave states were admitted in pairs, as if human freedom could be measured on a scale and kept even by arithmetic. But the expansion west made neutrality impossible. Every new territory reopened the wound. In the South, slavery was defended as tradition, economy, even destiny. In the North, opposition grew louder, but not always purer. Some fought slavery on moral grounds, others feared competition. Few truly imagined racial equality. Hypocrisy crossed every border. Enslaved people, however, did not wait for permission to want freedom. They fled when they could. They resisted when escape was impossible. They preserved families under constant threat of separation. Spirituals carried coded messages. Hope traveled through whispers and prayer. Harriet Tubman returned to the South again and again, defying death with every step, turning the Underground Railroad into an artery of defiance. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the system finally broke. Southern states did not wait. One by one, they declared secession, convinced they were preserving their way of life. What they were preserving was bondage. The Civil War did not begin as a war to end slavery. It began as a war to preserve the Union. But war has a way of stripping away illusions. As the fighting dragged on and bodies piled higher, the truth became impossible to ignore. The nation could not be half free and half enslaved. It had to choose. Battlefields turned into slaughterhouses. Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, names that would later be spoken with reverence, were, in their time, scenes of horror. Soldiers marched into gunfire, believing in causes they barely understood. Letters home spoke of fear, boredom, faith, and regret. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the meaning of the war. Enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands. Black soldiers enlisted, fighting for a country that had never fully recognized them as citizens. They fought anyway. When the war ended, the Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the nation stood exhausted, victorious and broken at the same time. Lincoln would not live to guide the peace. His assassination left the future in the hands of men far less capable of mercy. Reconstruction was a moment of radical possibility. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools, founded churches. For a brief time, America came close to becoming what it claimed to be. Then the backlash came. Federal troops withdrew. White supremacist violence filled the vacuum. Laws were rewritten to control without chains. Jim Crow rose where slavery had fallen. Segregation became policy. Terror became enforcement. The promise of Reconstruction was buried beneath fear and fatigue. America moved on, but millions were left behind. The nation industrialized at breathtaking speed. Steel, oil, railroads, and electricity reshaped daily life. Cities grew upward and outward. Immigrants poured in from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Each group promised opportunity and greeted with suspicion. Signs reading "No Irish," "No Italians," "No Jews" revealed that the American dream had conditions. Children worked in factories. Miners suffocated underground. Women fought for suffrage while being told politics would ruin their femininity. Progress demanded sacrifice, but rarely from those at the top. Then came the First World War. America entered late, but emerged changed. Soldiers returned to a society unsure of what it owed them. The 1920s roared with prosperity for some and desperation for others. Prohibition fueled crime. Jazz challenged tradition. Women cut their hair, raised their voices, and refused to return to silence. The illusion shattered in 1929. The stock market crash erased wealth overnight. Banks collapsed. Farmers lost land. Families lost dignity. The Great Depression tested the idea of American self-reliance to its limits. Survival became collective. The New Deal reshaped the relationship between citizens and government. Programs put people to work. Hope returned slowly, unevenly. Critics called it socialism. Supporters called it salvation. Before the nation could fully recover, the world descended into war again. World War II demanded total mobilization. Factories retooled. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. African Americans migrated north and west, seeking jobs denied to them in the South. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, their loyalty questioned solely because of ancestry. Victory came at unimaginable cost. Europe lay in ruins. The Holocaust revealed depths of cruelty that defied comprehension. America emerged powerful, but morally tested. The Cold War followed, defined by fear and ideology. Nuclear weapons turned survival into a calculation measured in minutes. Loyalty was scrutinized. Dissent was suspect. Freedom existed, but carefully watched. At home, the contradictions sharpened again. Black veterans returned from fighting fascism abroad, only to face segregation at home. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States no longer resembled the fragile chain of colonies that had once clung to the Atlantic coast. It had become a continental force, wide, ambitious, and internally divided. The land stretched farther than its moral certainty. The question that haunted the nation was no longer whether America would survive, but what kind of nation it would become. At the center of everything stood slavery. For decades it had been tolerated, rationalized, postponed. Politicians spoke of balance. Compromise after compromise was hammered together, each one thinner than the last. Free states and slave states were admitted in pairs, as if human freedom could be measured on a scale and kept even by arithmetic. But the expansion west made neutrality impossible. Every new territory reopened the wound. In the South, slavery was defended as tradition, economy, even destiny. In the North, opposition grew louder, but not always purer. Some fought slavery on moral grounds. Others feared competition. Few truly imagined racial equality. Hypocrisy crossed every border. Enslaved people, however, did not wait for permission to want freedom. They fled when they could. They resisted when escape was impossible. They preserved families under constant threat of separation. Spirituals carried coded messages. Hope traveled through whispers and prayer. Harriet Tubman returned to the South again and again, defying death with every step, turning the Underground Railroad into an artery of defiance. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the system finally broke. Southern states did not wait. One by one, they declared secession, convinced they were preserving their way of life. What they were preserving was bondage. The Civil War did not begin as a war to end slavery. It began as a war to preserve the Union. But war has a way of stripping away illusions. As the fighting dragged on and bodies piled higher, the truth became impossible to ignore. The nation could not be half free and half enslaved. It had to choose. Battlefields turned into slaughterhouses. Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, names that would later be spoken with reverence, were, in their time, scenes of horror. Soldiers marched into gunfire, believing in causes they barely understood. Letters home spoke of fear, boredom, faith, and regret. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the meaning of the war. Enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands. Black soldiers enlisted, fighting for a country that had never fully recognized them as citizens. They fought anyway. When the war ended, the Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the nation stood exhausted, victorious and broken at the same time. Lincoln would not live to guide the peace. His assassination left the future in the hands of men far less capable of mercy. Reconstruction was a moment of radical possibility. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools, founded churches. For a brief time, America came close to becoming what it claimed to be. Then the backlash came. Federal troops withdrew. White supremacist violence filled the vacuum. Laws were rewritten to control without. By the time the 20th century moved past its midpoint, America had become something unprecedented in human history. A nation powerful enough to shape the fate of the entire world, yet uncertain enough to question its own soul. The victory in World War II did not bring peace of mind. It brought responsibility and fear. Two superpowers now stared at each other across oceans and ideologies, each armed with weapons capable of ending civilization. Children practiced nuclear drills in schools, hiding beneath desks as if wood and prayer could stop fire from the sky. Survival itself became political. Prosperity returned unevenly. Suburbs spread across the landscape, built on government loans and quiet exclusions. For many white families, the American dream materialized in lawns, cars, and televisions. For others, especially black Americans, the same dream remained barricaded by red lines on maps and laws written in polite language but enforced with cruelty. The civil rights victories of the 1950s and 1960s did not end racism. They merely made it illegal to be obvious. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy shattered illusions of moral certainty. Idealism bled into the streets. The nation mourned and moved on without fully healing. Vietnam dragged on, claiming lives and credibility at the same time. Trust in government fractured permanently. When the war finally ended, America was changed. Authority was no longer sacred. Journalism grew sharper. Protest became part of identity. Freedom of speech was tested not in theory, but in tear gas and batons. Then came Watergate. For the first time, Americans saw proof, not rumor, that a president could lie, abuse power, and fall. The resignation of Richard Nixon did not destroy the republic, but it scarred it. Faith in institutions eroded. Cynicism became survival. The late 20th century brought reinvention again. The Cold War thawed, then collapsed. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. America stood alone at the top, not triumphant, but unsure what came next. Technology accelerated everything. Computers shrank. The internet connected strangers. Information exploded. So did misinformation. Power shifted quietly from factories to screens. Wealth concentrated again, faster than before. The attacks of September 11, 2001 shattered complacency in a single morning. Smoke rose over New York. The Pentagon burned. Fear returned with clarity. The nation united briefly, instinctively. Flags appeared everywhere. So did suspicion. Wars followed, long, costly, ambiguous. Civil liberties narrowed in the name of security. Torture was debated, surveillance normalized. The question resurfaced once more: how much freedom would America trade for safety? The 2008 financial crisis exposed old patterns. Banks were rescued, homes were lost, inequality widened, anger simmered beneath recovery statistics. Social movements surged again: Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. Each forced the nation to confront truths it preferred to avoid. Each met resistance, claiming tradition, order, fatigue. Politics hardened into identity. Compromise became weakness. Facts became negotiable. The nation argued not just over policy, but over reality itself. A global pandemic tested everything: leadership, science, trust, empathy. Millions died, economies stalled, the social fabric strained under isolation and fear. The response revealed both generosity and selfishness, resilience and denial. Through it all, America continued to argue with itself in public. That argument is the country's defining feature. The story of the United States is not a march of heroes. It is a collision of people: indigenous, enslaved, immigrant, native-born, each carrying memory, loss, ambition, and belief. It is a nation born not from unity, but from disagreement held together by shared risk. The barefoot man on the shore did not know what America would become. None of the founders did. None of the soldiers, activists, workers, or dreamers did either. America was never finished. It is rebuilt daily by choices, some brave, some cruel, many contradictory. Its greatness lies not in perfection, but in the constant tension between its promises and its failures. History does not judge America by its words alone. It judges by what comes next.
History often remembers presidents, generals, and billionaires, but America was not built by speeches alone. It was built by ordinary people whose names never entered textbooks. People who woke before sunrise, endured silence, humiliation, danger, and still believed tomorrow could be better than today. In the cotton fields of the South after Reconstruction collapsed, black families worked land they did not own, trapped in systems designed to look like opportunity but function like control. Sharecropping replaced slavery in form, not in outcome. Debt became the new chain. Yet even there, parents taught children to read by candlelight, believing knowledge itself was resistance. In crowded tenements of New York, Chicago, and Boston, immigrant families shared single rooms, language barriers, and suspicion from neighbors who feared replacement. Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, Chinese, each group labeled un-American before becoming part of America. Mothers stitched garments until fingers bled. Fathers died building bridges and tunnels others would later cross without knowing their names. During the Dust Bowl, families packed their lives into broken trucks and drove west on rumors. California promised work. Often it delivered rejection. Camps filled with displaced Americans, starving not from laziness, but from collapse beyond their control. Still, children played, songs were sung, survival itself became an act of dignity. Women's labor, paid and unpaid, held families together through wars and depressions. They rationed, organized, marched, and voted late but decisively. When factories opened during World War II, women proved competence had never been the issue. When soldiers returned, many were told to disappear again. Some refused.
The civil rights movement was not just speeches and marches. It was maids walking miles to work after refusing segregated buses. It was students sitting silently while being screamed at, spat on, beaten. It was churches burned, families threatened, and courage summoned repeatedly without reward. In Appalachia, miners descended into darkness knowing collapse was possible every day. In the Midwest, farmers balanced faith and bankruptcy. On reservations, Native communities fought to preserve culture after centuries of forced erasure. In barrios and inner cities, generations navigated systems designed to overlook them. America's contradictions lived in these lives. Progress arrived unevenly. Laws changed faster than attitudes. Rights were granted faster than respect. Victories were declared while wounds remained open. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new struggles wrapped in modern language. Automation replaced labor. Education promised mobility while debt multiplied. Healthcare saved lives while bankrupting families. Technology connected people while isolating them. Social media turned opinion into weaponry. Outrage traveled faster than reflection. History itself became contested ground. Some demanded reckoning, others demanded forgetting. Both claimed patriotism. Yet beneath the noise, ordinary Americans continued to live their lives, raising children, caring for elders, working multiple jobs, volunteering quietly, voting despite disillusionment. Democracy survived not because it was easy, but because participation refused to disappear entirely. Every crisis revealed the same truth. America's strength did not come from consensus, it came from endurance. The nation's story is not about innocence lost. It is about responsibility inherited. Each generation receives a country shaped by the last and reshapes it knowingly or not. Silence becomes a choice. Action becomes a risk. The barefoot man on the shore did not know he was stepping into an argument that would last centuries. He only knew he wanted a chance. Millions after him wanted the same. Some took it from others. Some expanded it. Some defended it at great cost. America remains unfinished because it is human. Its history is not a monument. It is a conversation, often angry, often painful, sometimes inspiring. It asks the same question again and again, refusing to settle for a single answer. Who are we willing to be? The future will not be decided by memory alone, but by what is remembered honestly, what is confronted courageously, and what is chosen collectively. The story continues.
To understand America is to understand contradiction as a permanent condition. The nation was born from rebellion against empire, yet became one. It declared liberty universal while practicing exclusion. It preached individualism while relying on collective sacrifice. These tensions were not accidents. They were baked into the foundation, carried forward not as mistakes easily corrected, but as challenges repeatedly postponed. What made the American story different was not purity of intention, but scale of consequence. Decisions made in distant rooms reshaped lives across oceans. Markets in New York determined hunger in the Midwest and despair in foreign capitals. Military power projected ideals and destruction with equal efficiency. The world watched, learned, imitated, resisted. American culture traveled faster than its self-understanding. Music born in pain became global language. Films exported dreams that often hid their origins. Technology promised liberation while concentrating control. The image of America, confident, free, prosperous, became as influential as its policies. But images fracture under pressure. When factories closed and towns hollowed out, resentment replaced optimism. When education became a privilege disguised as opportunity, faith in fairness eroded. When wars ended without clarity or victory, trust collapsed further. The social contract thinned. People felt unseen, unheard, disposable. Populism rose not from ignorance alone, but from abandonment. Elites spoke fluently of globalization, while communities buried traditions. Progress became something that happened elsewhere, for others. Anger searched for targets. History offered many. The nation argued again, this time not only about policy, but about belonging itself. Immigration, race, gender, truth. The same unresolved questions returned, louder than before. Who deserves protection? Who decides what is real? What does loyalty mean in a fractured age? Institutions strained under the weight. Courts, media, elections, all contested. Democracy revealed its fragility not as failure, but as exposure. Systems built on trust cannot function when trust dissolves. And yet, collapse never fully arrived. Local acts of courage continued quietly. Teachers stayed late, nurses returned to understaffed wards, journalists refused silence, volunteers filled gaps government could not or would not. The nation did not move as one, but it moved. History rarely offers redemption in clean arcs. It offers pressure. It asks whether ideals are strong enough to survive reality. America's greatest export has never been power, it has been possibility, the dangerous idea that change is allowed, that authority can be questioned, that identity is not fixed by birth alone. These ideas inspired revolutions abroad and resistance at home. They frightened tyrants, they unsettled comfort. But possibility cuts both ways. It allows reinvention and denial. It empowers justice and manipulation. Without memory, possibility becomes chaos. Without accountability, freedom decays. The American experiment persists because it has never been completed. Closure would require agreement. Agreement has never been its strength. Debate has. From indigenous resistance to abolitionist struggle, from labor movements to civil rights, progress arrived when people refused the stories they were told about inevitability. Nothing changed because it was supposed to. It changed because someone paid a price. The barefoot man on the shore wanted escape. Others wanted land. Others wanted freedom. Others wanted control. America absorbed them all and became a mirror reflecting collective intention. What it reflects next depends on choices not yet made. History does not end with explanation, it ends with responsibility. The past cannot be corrected, only understood. The future cannot be guaranteed, only shaped. America remains what it has always been, a question asked in public, answered imperfectly, and asked again. The story continues forward, unfinished, unresolved, and entirely human.
Every nation invents myths to survive. America was no different. It told itself stories of endless frontiers, self-made success, and moral leadership. These myths were not entirely false, but they were incomplete. And incompleteness, when mistaken for truth, becomes dangerous. The frontier closed, but the hunger for expansion did not. It simply turned inward. As the 20th century progressed, the idea of success narrowed. Prosperity was no longer measured by stability or community, but by growth without limit. Consumption replaced citizenship. Advertising taught people what to want before teaching them why. Debt became invisible until it became crushing. Meanwhile, entire communities slipped into historical silence. Native nations continued to fight for sovereignty in courts that rarely understood them.
Treaties signed centuries earlier were argued as if they were inconveniences rather than obligations. Land taken was rarely returned. Cultural survival became resistance by default. Black Americans, legally free but structurally constrained, navigated a world that demanded excellence to earn basic dignity. Progress existed, but so did punishment for visibility. Each gain was answered by backlash. Advancement triggered fear. Fear fueled policy. Immigration debates resurfaced in cycles, each generation convinced it was witnessing something new. The same accusations repeated: crime, disloyalty, cultural dilution. The same reality followed: labor extracted, humanity questioned, belonging delayed. America did not fail these groups by accident. It failed them by design and by neglect. Yet resistance adapted. Grassroots organizing replaced centralized movements. Power shifted from speeches to systems. Lawsuits challenged discrimination quietly. Cultural influence reshaped perception when politics stalled. Change moved sideways when forward was blocked. Technology accelerated contradiction again. Algorithms rewarded outrage. Attention became currency. Truth competed with entertainment and often lost. The past was compressed into slogans. Context disappeared. Memory fragmented. Young Americans inherited not only debt and climate anxiety, but historical exhaustion. They were told the nation was great and broken at the same time, without explanation of how both could be true. Many disengaged, others radicalized, some rebuilt meaning locally when national narratives failed. Crises overlapped. Climate disasters exposed inequality instantly. Floods and fires respected no ideology, but recovery always did. Who was protected, insured, relocated? These decisions revealed priorities long hidden. Public health emergencies revealed the same patterns. Science competed with belief. Collective action collided with individual freedom. Survival itself became politicized. And still, life continued. People married, mourned, celebrated, voted, protested, adapted. History did not pause for coherence. It pressed forward regardless of understanding. America's endurance was never about certainty. It was about flexibility under strain. Systems bent. Sometimes they broke. Sometimes they were rebuilt by those previously excluded. The country's most meaningful transformations rarely came from consensus. They came from pressure applied unevenly until resistance became impossible to ignore. The barefoot man on the shore was not heroic. He was desperate. So were many who followed. Enslaved people escaping north, immigrants crossing oceans, families crossing borders, workers crossing picket lines, activists crossing lines of fear. Desperation built America as much as hope did. The danger came when desperation was denied, when suffering was dismissed as personal failure instead of structural outcome. That denial hardened hearts. It slowed reform. It extended pain. History does not punish nations for imperfection. It punishes them for refusal to learn. America's past offers no comfort without honesty. Pride without accountability becomes propaganda. Criticism without commitment becomes abandonment. The story demands something harder: engagement without illusion. The argument continues not because America is broken beyond repair, but because repair was never meant to be easy. Democracy was designed not to resolve conflict, but to contain it without violence. When containment fails, violence returns. The lesson repeats across centuries. What is ignored accumulates. What is denied radicalizes. What is confronted transforms.
America's future remains unwritten, not because it lacks direction, but because direction is contested by design. The story continues.
Power changes people long before it changes nations. America learned this slowly, often too late. The same ideals that once justified rebellion were later used to justify dominance. Freedom, when detached from responsibility, became permission. Strength, when unexamined, became entitlement. The psychology of a young nation shaped everything that followed. America grew up believing survival required expansion, that safety came from control, that leadership meant never appearing weak. These beliefs hardened into instinct. They guided foreign policy, economic systems, and cultural narratives. Even when evidence suggested restraint, the habit of force remained. Abroad, American intervention carried mixed consequences. In some places, it rebuilt shattered societies. In others, it destabilized regions for generations. Intentions were often declared noble, outcomes were often ambiguous. The gap between the two widened distrust, not only overseas but at home. Citizens were asked to support wars they barely understood, fought by volunteers drawn disproportionately from communities with fewer options. Patriotism became ritual, sacrifice became normalized, accountability drifted upward and disappeared. At home, power expressed itself differently. Surveillance expanded quietly, corporate influence grew louder. Markets were treated as neutral forces even as they shaped morality. Decisions affecting millions were framed as inevitabilities rather than choices. This framing mattered. When harm is presented as unavoidable, resistance appears irrational. When inequality is naturalized, empathy erodes. When history is simplified, responsibility dissolves. Education became a battleground. What should children learn about their country? Triumph or truth? Pride or context? The struggle over memory was never about the past alone. It was about permission to question the present. Those who benefited most from existing structures called critique unpatriotic. Those harmed by them called silence complicity. The divide widened not because Americans lacked shared values, but because they ranked them differently. Freedom of speech clashed with freedom from harm. Individual rights collided with collective survival. The Constitution became both shield and sword, interpreted through lenses shaped by experience and fear. Still, the nation held, not because it avoided crisis, but because crisis forced adaptation. Cultural shifts often preceded legal ones. Art told stories law refused to hear. Music carried grief and defiance across borders. Literature preserved nuance when politics demanded simplicity. Even entertainment reflected anxiety beneath optimism. America exported these contradictions globally. Its movies showed victory, its history showed cost. Both were true. As the 21st century advanced, the speed of change outpaced comprehension. News cycles collapsed into moments. Outrage became constant. Fatigue followed. People withdrew not from apathy, but from overload. Democracy requires attention. Attention became scarce. And yet, moments of clarity emerged. Young people organized with tools unimaginable to previous generations. Marginalized voices bypassed gatekeepers. Stories once buried reached millions. Power resisted but adapted again. The question was no longer whether America could change, it was whether it could change without breaking. The barefoot man on the shore did not fear complexity, he feared failure. America now feared complexity itself, because complexity demanded patience, humility, and listening. These were not traits rewarded by modern systems. But history showed something consistent. When the nation listened, however briefly, it improved. When it silenced dissent, it stagnated. When it acknowledged harm, it healed partially. When it denied harm, it repeated it.
The American story was never about certainty, it was about correction. No generation solved the puzzle completely. Each inherited tools and damage. Each left something unresolved. That inheritance was not a curse, it was the cost of self-rule. The world continued to watch America, not as a model, but as a signal. Its successes suggested possibility, its failures offered warning, its contradictions mirrored global struggles between power and dignity. The story was no longer just national, it was human.
As centuries layered themselves one upon another, America arrived at a strange moment in its long life. Old enough to carry deep scars, young enough to believe reinvention was still possible. The nation stood not at an ending, but at a reckoning shaped less by single events than by accumulated consequence. History had taught Americans how to win wars, build industries, and expand influence. It had not taught them how to listen to one another when fear replaced curiosity. The deeper conflict was no longer only political, it was emotional. People felt displaced in their own country by economic shifts, demographic change, cultural evolution. Familiar stories no longer explained the world they woke up to. When identity feels threatened, memory becomes selective. People remember what comforts them and forget what challenges them. This selective memory reshaped patriotism. For some, patriotism meant defense of symbols, borders, traditions, and hierarchy. For others, it meant critique of injustice, exclusion, and unkept promises. Both claimed love of country. Both believed the other misunderstood America's soul. The argument intensified because it was not abstract. It played out in classrooms, courtrooms, workplaces, and homes. Families stopped talking. Communities fragmented, truth itself fractured into competing narratives. Yet beneath the noise, quieter realities persisted. Children still needed education, the sick still needed care, infrastructure still decayed regardless of ideology, climate change advanced without waiting for consensus. The future demanded cooperation even as trust thinned. History offered no shortcut here. The most durable periods of American progress had come not from moral superiority, but from uncomfortable coalitions, people who disagreed deeply but recognized shared risk. That recognition was now harder to reach because digital life rewarded isolation and certainty over doubt. But history also showed that exhaustion often precedes clarity. Moments of extreme division had appeared before the Civil War, during Reconstruction, during the Great Depression, during the Civil Rights era. Each time the nation teetered. Each time transformation followed, not cleanly, not fully, but meaningfully. Transformation required something rare, the willingness to see oneself as part of the problem. This was America's hardest lesson. The barefoot man on the shore had believed he was escaping history. He was stepping into it. Every generation since has done the same, believing their moment was unique, their fears unprecedented. History suggests otherwise. What changes is not the struggle, but the tools. The moral inheritance of the United States is not its Constitution alone, or its victories, or its wealth. It is its unfinished obligations. To indigenous nations still seeking justice, to descendants of enslaved people still facing structural inequality, to immigrants balancing gratitude with grief, to future generations inheriting environmental damage they did not choose. These obligations are not punishments, they are responsibilities born of power. A nation capable of great harm is also capable of great repair, but only if it abandons the fantasy of innocence. Innocence belongs to childhood. Nations must grow out of it or remain dangerous. Hope, in the American context, was never passive, it was stubborn. It survived disappointment by adjusting expectation rather than surrendering agency. It lived in local victories when national ones stalled. It appeared in people who refused to let cynicism define their entire relationship with the future. America's story does not end with agreement. It ends, if it ever ends, with participation, with people choosing again and again to engage rather than withdraw, to argue without erasing, to remember without mythologizing, to criticize without abandoning, to build without denying what was broken. The country was never a promise kept. It was a promise argued over. And that argument, loud, painful, imperfect, is the sound of a nation still alive. The barefoot man's footprints on the shore were washed away by the tide within hours, but the consequences of that step still move beneath the surface, shaping currents unseen. The story continues forward, not toward certainty, but toward responsibility.
There comes a point in every long story when momentum slows and meaning deepens, not because events stop happening, but because their weight demands reflection. America reached that point not once, but repeatedly, each time believing it was final, each time discovering it was only another pause before motion resumed. The nation's greatest illusions were not about greatness itself, but about arrival. The belief that history could be finished, that justice could be settled permanently, that democracy could be secured once and for all. These beliefs offered comfort. They were also false. America never arrived anywhere. It only moved. The cost of movement accumulated quietly. Economic growth left environmental damage behind it like an unpaid bill. Political victories left resentments unaddressed. Cultural progress left some feeling unseen, others unheard. Every solution created new tensions, demanding new imagination. What made America resilient was not optimism, it was confrontation. At its best moments, the country looked directly at its failures and refused to explain them away. The abolition of slavery did not erase racism, but it ended legal ownership of human beings. The civil rights movement did not end inequality, but it dismantled laws built to enforce it. Each step forward exposed how far remained. This pattern repeated because progress in America was not linear, it was dialectical. Thesis, resistance, synthesis, relapse. Understanding this rhythm mattered more than predicting outcomes. Nations that deny their cycles repeat them blindly. Nations that study them adapt. Power, however, resisted humility. Those who benefited most from existing systems often mistook advantage for merit. They believed success proved virtue. Failure, therefore, proved deficiency. This logic hardened policy and justified neglect. It allowed suffering to be framed as personal rather than structural. But history kept interrupting that story. Economic collapses revealed interconnectedness. Pandemics exposed dependence. Climate disasters erased illusions of insulation. No border, wealth bracket, or ideology offered immunity. Reality pressed back against abstraction. In these moments, Americans remembered something older than ideology: mutual reliance. Neighbors helped neighbors when institutions lagged. Communities organized relief when bureaucracy stalled. Faith groups, unions, volunteers filled gaps that power could not or would not address quickly. These acts rarely made headlines, but they sustained continuity. They also revealed a truth long buried beneath rhetoric. America functioned best when solidarity outweighed suspicion. This truth frightened those who equated unity with conformity. It threatened narratives built on hierarchy and fear. So it was resisted, rebranded, diluted, but it never disappeared entirely. The American character was not defined by agreement, but by persistence in disagreement without surrendering coexistence. That balance was fragile. It demanded restraint, empathy,
and shared commitment to process over outcome. When those traits weakened, institutions strained. Courts were asked to resolve cultural battles they were never designed to resolve alone. Elections became existential contests rather than civic mechanisms. Media ecosystems fragmented into affirmation rather than information. Each development intensified division while claiming to resolve it. And still, life continued. Children grew up knowing no other America than one in constant argument. For some, this bred cynicism, for others, urgency. They inherited not nostalgia, but necessity. Their activism looked different. Their language was sharper, their patience shorter, their demands less symbolic, more systemic. They asked questions earlier generations avoided. Why was healthcare tied to employment? Why did education cost a lifetime of debt? Why did prosperity for some require precarity for others? Why were some histories celebrated and others suppressed? These questions unsettled comfort. They also revived the democratic impulse that had sparked rebellion centuries earlier, the insistence that authority must justify itself. The barefoot man on the shore did not know he was entering a cycle. He only knew he could not stay where he was. America has always been built by those refusing stagnation, even when movement carried risk. That refusal remains its defining trait. The danger lies not in conflict, but in exhaustion. When citizens disengage, power consolidates quietly. When participation fades, accountability follows. Democracy does not collapse in spectacle alone. It erodes through indifference. History's warning is subtle but relentless. What is not actively maintained decays. America's story, then, is not a lesson in destiny. It is a lesson in effort. It teaches that ideals without maintenance become slogans, that freedom without responsibility becomes chaos, that memory without honesty becomes myth. The future does not ask America to be perfect. It asks it to be awake.
The story of America reaches no tidy conclusion. Its chapters pile atop each other, sometimes messy, sometimes triumphant, often contradictory. But patterns emerge, subtle and persistent if one looks closely enough. Resilience, reinvention, and the relentless negotiation between power and conscience. The 20th and 21st centuries proved this once again. Wars, economic upheavals, civil rights struggles, technological revolutions, and cultural renaissances all collided in rapid succession. Yet the nation endured, not because it was inevitable, but because countless individuals, often invisible, often uncelebrated, persisted. They were nurses, teachers, activists, factory workers, immigrants, veterans, mothers, fathers, and children. They endured not for accolades, but because someone had to. America's moral compass was never perfect. It never will be. Every victory carried compromise. Every failure demanded reflection. The same ideal that allowed settlers to envision new freedom simultaneously imposed suffering on others. The same Constitution that guaranteed liberty for some postponed justice for many. Recognizing that duality is uncomfortable, but it is essential. Hope in the American story is not naive, it is deliberate. It survives by demanding participation, vigilance, and engagement. Progress is measured not in perfection, but in how society responds to its failures. When marginalized voices are heard, when injustice is confronted, when citizens act collectively, the nation moves forward, even if unevenly, painfully, and imperfectly.
The barefoot man on the shore, who first set foot in this contested land centuries ago, could not have imagined skyscrapers, airplanes, satellites, or the internet. He could not have known that his descendants would argue endlessly about who belongs, what counts as justice, or how to protect the planet for future generations. But he would recognize the impulse that drove them, the refusal to accept destiny as fixed, the desire to remake one's world, and the courage to try, even when the odds were stacked against them. That courage is America's inheritance. Every generation receives the nation as it is, flawed, uneven, contested, and reshapes it through choices, large and small. Some wound, some heal, some inspire, some betray. History observes silently, recording both glory and error. It offers neither absolution nor condemnation, only accountability in the long, patient measure of time. The nation's story is fundamentally human. It is the story of ordinary people encountering extraordinary circumstances, their hopes, their failures, their compassion, and their cruelty. It is the story of ideas made real, of ideals tested, and the endless tension between aspiration and reality. The United States continues to be built on participation, on citizens refusing to be passive, refusing to be silent, and refusing to accept injustice as permanent. That is why the country remains unfinished. That is why it remains alive. The barefoot man's footprints are long gone, yet the echoes of his step, of human courage, ambition, and moral questioning persist in every act of citizenship, every struggle for justice, every moment when someone dares to insist that the nation can be better than it was yesterday. History does not end with a single story, nor does it end with victory or defeat. It continues forward through responsibility, choice, and memory. America is not a promise fulfilled, it is a promise argued over, painfully, imperfectly, and endlessly. And that argument continues today.
The 21st century arrived like no other in American history. The nation had grown enormous in scale and influence, yet fragile in unexpected ways. Technology accelerated life, information traveled faster than comprehension, and crises layered upon one another, economic, environmental, political, and social. Each exposed the same underlying truth. The health of the country depended not on abstraction, but on the choices of ordinary people. The nation's global power was unmatched, yet its internal cohesion faltered. Communities fractured along ideological, racial, and economic lines. Distrust became routine. Institutions designed to mediate conflict, courts, legislatures, regulatory bodies, faced strains that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. Participation was no longer merely a right, it was a requirement for survival. Democracy demanded attention. Indifference could be fatal. At the same time, moments of inspiration emerged in abundance. Grassroots organizing, advocacy, and civic engagement flourished, often digitally, often in neighborhoods previously overlooked. Social movements reminded the nation that freedom and equality were not static gifts, they were actions, continuously demanded and defended. Americans realized again and again that the future of the nation could not be outsourced to elites, institutions, or myths. The environmental crises of the new century forced a confrontation with reality on an unprecedented scale. Hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and droughts revealed vulnerability that no amount of technology or wealth could fully shield. Yet these crises also created the possibility for collective action on a massive scale.
It became increasingly clear that human survival and the survival of democratic institutions depended on the willingness of citizens to engage, adapt, and act for the long term. Economics, too, continued to challenge America's sense of fairness. The concentration of wealth produced unprecedented opportunities for some, but inequality deepened for others. Jobs shifted, industries declined, and labor markets evolved faster than social safety nets. People learned, again and again, that prosperity was never guaranteed, and that freedom required responsibility, not just aspiration. Meanwhile, culture and identity became battlegrounds. Immigration, race, gender, and sexuality all demanded acknowledgement. Americans debated not only policy, but the very definitions of citizenship and belonging. The same questions that had haunted the nation from its earliest years, who counts, who decides, who belongs, reappeared in new forms, forcing each generation to confront the consequences of the past while navigating an uncertain future. Yet for all its trials, America's defining trait remained unchanged, the refusal to remain static. When confronted with injustice, citizens acted. When confronted with danger, they adapted. When confronted with failure, they persisted. Ordinary people, teachers, nurses, volunteers, activists, parents, children, continued to carry the nation forward. The barefoot man's step onto the shore centuries earlier had been small, almost invisible, yet the echo of that step, the willingness to enter uncertainty, to act despite fear, to hope against odds, remained at the heart of America. Every generation inherited the consequences of previous steps. The 21st century arrived like no other in American history. The nation had grown enormous in scale and influence, yet fragile in unexpected ways. Technology accelerated life, information traveled faster than comprehension, and crises layered upon one another: economic, environmental, political, and social. Each exposed the same underlying truth: the health of the country depended not on abstraction, but on the choices of ordinary people. The nation's global power was unmatched, yet its internal cohesion faltered. Communities fractured along ideological, racial, and economic lines. Distrust became routine. Institutions designed to mediate conflict, courts, legislatures, regulatory bodies, faced strains that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. Participation was no longer merely a right, it was a requirement for survival. Democracy demanded attention. Indifference could be fatal. At the same time, moments of inspiration emerged in abundance. Grassroots organizing, advocacy, and civic engagement flourished, often digitally, often in neighborhoods previously overlooked. Social movements reminded the nation that freedom and equality were not static gifts, they were actions, continuously demanded and defended. Americans realized again and again that the future of the nation could not be outsourced to elites, institutions, or myths. The environmental crises of the new century forced a confrontation with reality on an unprecedented scale. Hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and droughts revealed vulnerability that no amount of technology or wealth could fully shield. Yet these crises also created the possibility for collective action on a massive scale. It became increasingly clear that human survival and the survival of democratic institutions depended on the willingness of citizens to engage, adapt, and act for the long term. Economics, too, continued to challenge America's sense of fairness. The concentration of wealth produced unprecedented opportunities for some, but inequality deepened for others. Jobs shifted, industries declined, and labor markets evolved faster than social safety nets. People learned, again and again, that prosperity was never guaranteed, and that freedom required responsibility, not just aspiration. Meanwhile, culture and identity became battlegrounds. Immigration, race, gender, and sexuality all demanded acknowledgement. Americans debated not only policy, but the very definitions of citizenship and belonging. The same questions that had haunted the nation from its earliest years, who counts, who decides, who belongs, reappeared in new forms, forcing each generation to confront the consequences of the past while navigating an uncertain future. Yet for all its trials, America's defining trait remained unchanged, the refusal to remain static. When confronted with injustice, citizens acted. When confronted with danger, they adapted. When confronted with failure, they persisted. Ordinary people, teachers, nurses, volunteers, activists, parents, children, continued to carry the nation forward. The barefoot man's step onto the shore centuries earlier had been small, almost invisible, yet the echo of that step, the willingness to enter uncertainty, to act despite fear, to hope against odds, remained at the heart of America. Every generation inherited the consequences of previous steps and the moral responsibility to take the next one. History does not reward perfection, it rewards endurance, reflection, and engagement. America's greatness lies not in any single triumph, but in the repeated insistence that ideals must be pursued, even when imperfectly, and that freedom is not inherited, it is continuously fought for, defended, and defined. The story continues, always unfinished, always human, always in motion. And so the story reaches its present, not as an ending, but as a reflection, a mirror held up to a nation still in motion. The United States of America is neither flawless nor predetermined. It is neither fully redeemed nor entirely condemned. It is alive, shaped by struggle, hope, contradiction, courage, and failure. From the barefoot man who first set foot on its shores, centuries earlier, his step had been small, almost invisible. Yet the echo of that step, the willingness to enter uncertainty, to act despite fear, to hope against odds, remained at the heart of America. Every generation inherited the consequences of previous steps and the moral responsibility to take the next one. History does not reward perfection, it rewards endurance, reflection, and engagement. America's greatness lies not in any single triumph, but in the repeated insistence that ideals must be pursued, even when imperfectly, and that freedom is not inherited, it is continuously fought for, defended, and defined. The story continues, always unfinished, always human, always in motion.